Yes, this is the Velier UF30E 1985 27-year-old rum. There's just so much good stuff about this. I don't know where to start. Age 27 years old in tropical weather, 814 bottles produced from 3 barrels. Before I get into the tasting notes of this thing, I should tell you a little bit about Velier if you haven't already been involved in some of the history of the thing. If you've read Luca Gargano's book or my own essay on Velier and so on. Let's just start at the beginning. There is such a thing as the age of Velier's Demeraras. And one of the things about it is that for about a period of about 5 or 6 years, starting in around, I think it was 2005, 2006 maybe, Velier started to have a relationship with Demerara Distillers Limited. And as a consequence of that, they were allowed to select certain barrels, always from a predetermined selection, from DDL's warehouses, because of the relationship between DDL and Luca Gargano himself. And the impression I always got was that they were trying to get rid of barrels that they themselves didn't know what to do with, because Demerara Distillers was producing, even by then, they were producing the 12-year-old, the 15-year-old, the 21-year-old, the 25 sometimes, as well as all the younger stuff down the range. And they were not in the independent bottling business. They didn't do microscopic 1 barrel, 2 barrel, 3 barrel small blends and try to put that out to the market. That whole thing was in its infancy at the time, and nobody knew what they could do with these various older barrels that were moldering away for so long. And it took, let's use the word, it took a visionary to kind of like see the potential of these things. So what ended up happening was that Luca did, in point of fact, manage to pick up a number of barrels which have become grail quests and legends ever since then. And you could talk about the 1973 Skeldon, you could talk about the 1978 Skeldon, you could talk about the Blairmont 1982, and of course, the UF30E. Now, the UF30E is, I wanted to really talk about that, not just to focus on what Velier has managed to accomplish, because they literally changed the face of the rum world or accelerated trends that were already getting ahead of steam. But Velier basically managed to put together something very interesting here. So first of all, the UF30E stands for Uitvlugt Field 30 East. So it's probably one of the first examples of a parcellaire, which is now a thing, especially in Martinique, of a microclimate kind of rum, where the cane and the distillate came from one very specific subset of a particular area. In this case, of course, the Uitvlugt plantation, or estate, if you want to use the word, right, in Guyana. And then it was run through the French Saval still. I don't know the settings, but it was run through that and then put to age for 30 years. Now, usually all these various bits and pieces of the various Saval still outputs or the wooden still outputs were blended into the main marks that were selling the world around. But it took Luca to understand that there perhaps could be a way to make these things even better by doing as kind of like a single or a very limited cask strength edition, right? Because at the time, 40% was it. And here now he decided, you know what, enough of this nonsense. We're going to push this out at cask strength, which was 60.7%. Now, Velier did actually put out earlier versions of these Demerara rums. You know, I think there was an Albion, there was a Diamond, there was something else, I forget. There was 3 of them. They never really gained much traction. It's when he started doing these black bottles with these really informative labels that things started to really turn around. And even then it took years for the appreciation to gestate properly. So another thing I wanted to point out was the label. Look at this label. I mean, there's so much information in so little acreage that it really is quite impressive. It tells you where it's from. It tells you how many bottles they were. It tells you how old it was. It tells you how strong it was. It tells you who was distilled. It tells you when it was bottled, right? And at the back end, it tells you the angel share, which in this case is 90%. 27 years in the tropics, yeah, I could believe that, especially when you're talking about 3 barrels. One could almost wonder, like, okay, so you had 3 barrels, but how much was in each barrel, right? But you got 814 bottles out of it, so it must have been reasonably substantial. And I guess it was something like, 20 barrels that got consolidated down into 3 as the years passed. There's another reason why I want to talk about this particular rum today. I've been doing some bottom feeders and low enders and cheap white rums now for a while. I've mentioned rums from Bayou, from some Canadian distilleries, from some Canadian, almost all round distilleries and so on. And in many cases, far too many as far as I'm concerned, the work that they have done has been subpar at best. And perhaps it's time to understand, or at least focus some attention on stuff that is absolutely superlative, as this is. You notice the big glass? Christ. This puts rums made for the masses to shame. I don't want to sound elitist, and it really isn't that, but this was also one of the first examples I had of a rum that literally blew my mind. It is so rich. It is so intense. There's just so much going on here. It is one of the best rums of its kind that I ever had the fortunate experience to taste at that point. Now, I bought this in one of the best rum stores in Germany, the Rum Depot, run by Dirk Becker, who runs the German Rum Festival, in 2012, when I took my little boy, the little Caner, who's now the big Caner, and is giving me attitude. I took him into Rum Depot and he sat down for 3 hours while I was just going crazy in that place. I think I bought like about €1,000 worth of stuff that day. And this was one of the ones I brought home with me. With good reason. I'd never seen anything like this. Like, of course, I knew all the Guyanese estates. I'd been to many of them in my youth, right? But to actually have something so specific when all you're listening to is Port Morant or Enmore or whatever, when you actually see something like Blairmont or LBI or, Port Morant or Albion or Uitvlugt, it's just like, wow, that's really specific. I had to get these, even though they were like €100, €150 at a pop at that time. Of course, they're going for thousands now on the secondary sites. But it's when you nose this, when you smell it, that you begin to understand why Velier got the fame it did at the time it did for these rums. Jesus. So there's licorice. There is wood. There's a woodiness to it. You can't get away from that. There's a slight bit of sweetness to it. Grapes, marzipan, cumin, spices, breakfast spices, nutmeg, cinnamon, and a ton of chopped black fruit. Now, in the West Indies, there's this thing called black cake, but black cake is really just a rum cake with lots and lots and lots of rum-infused fruit inside, and it can stay good for years. I make jokes about, a year after a wedding, you get a slice of the cake, and it's still every bit as good as the day you made it. It's because rums are put into it, right? And this is so rich, so pungent, so intense, so complex that I have never yet shared any of this with anybody who didn't immediately say, holy crap, even in the company of very, very good rums that surround it. And those would have been Guyanese or Jamaicans or Barbadians or whatever. But the UF30E is on a level all of its own. Oh, I could smell this all day. Wow. 60.7% should not be this gentle. You can drink it neat, and you get a sort of like a brownish series of notes of wood bark, of mauby. Again, those concentrated chopped black fruits like prunes and blackberries, blueberries, and what have you. There is dark grapes. There is a ton of this kind of thing in there. And there's a nice citrus line running through it, port-infused cigarillos. The finish is freaking epic. It just goes on forever. It's not that rums today are bad. The very fact that my scores have gradually crept up and up and up for any kind of rums that are being made shows that the overall quality ladder is constantly being improved upon, whether it's from Australia or Barbados or Guyana or the United States, Canada even, and so on. There is this joy of experimentation that is bringing everybody up, and the independent bottlers are helping by picking some really significant casts like SBS does, or Rum Deluxe does, or Colors of Rum does. Velier was the one, to my mind, that started them all off. And it's a rum like this that tells you why they have the reputation that they do. Oh, it's just too good. All right. So I have this thing about, I wrote a 3-part essay called The Age of Velier's Demerara's, where I spoke specifically to these rums in the black bottles. And in point of fact, it was around, I think, 2014 maybe, that the whole edifice kind of crumbled after DDL decided that they were going to take over and start doing their own rums, which they didn't really, but I've talked about this as well. What I'm saying about the UF30E and its like is that they showed the potential of what rum could be. And yes, they were all Demeraras. And of course, they were then superseded by the Coronas, which came somewhat later. And of course, in all the years since then, Velier has managed always to pick these really incredible casks out there and put them out in the open, whether it's the Foursquare Collaboration series, whether it's the Indian Ocean series, or the Endemic Birds and the Hamptons, of course. I want to spare a note to say that the stocks that the man got from Yoshihiro Takeuchi of Nine Leaves after Nine Leaves folded its tents in 2023, those are really quite spectacular as well. So to my mind, this is, I like talking about origins and, like what was the first thing that ever happened, the way Moll Flanders was one of the first novels ever written, or the way the Tale of Genji put literature in a different path of that. There's all sorts of origin stories about all sorts of different things. This is one, to me, that is an origin of the age that we are living through right now. And it's to the testament to its longevity that this thing still is known. You all know about it, and it is really one of the best rums of its kind. Now, at the time, when I wrote my review in 2013, on a basis of a bottle bought in 2012, I scored it 91 points. Now, normally, what tends to happen is that I tend to re-review rums that I've seen before, and I've developed a bit more, and they're not quite as hot shots. So it's not as they used to be, and my score actually goes down. But that 91 points that I scored this thing at back in the day, as far as I'm concerned, that is actually too low. This is a 96-point rum. Don't start me off with this 99-point shit. This is a 96-point rum that deserves every single one of them, right? And quite frankly, I absolutely do believe, even to this day, that this is one of the very top 5 rums I have ever tried and that has ever been made. It is that good. So if you can ever get some, by all means, try some. It's going to cost you an arm and a leg. I mean, I can't even imagine how much this thing goes for on the secondary market now. If you're in my neighborhood, I'll give you a dram for sure, just so that you can share into the experience that I had. And I got to tell you, I envy you for that experience that you're going to have for the first time and that I will have for the last time here. Cheers, everybody.